Hey everybody, my name is Jim Farmer. I'm the festival director of Out on Film. I'm so happy that you are here. This is our first year as a hybrid festival. We are in theaters this year, and we're also virtual. We have a lot of programming between both virtual and in person. One of my absolute favorite documentaries of the year is No Straight Lines: The Rise of Queer Comics. It's a lively look at 5 LGBTQ comic book artists whose careers go from the underground scene to the cover of Time magazine and the international stage. I am so happy and honored to have the director of the film, Vivian Kleiman.
Hi there.
And subjects from the film, Rupert, Kinnard, and Jen Camper. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for this is such a terrific documentary. I mean, thanks again for doing this. Vivian, how did this come up for you?
Oh, well, it started by a friend of mine, Greg Sirota, who had started this project with a friend of his, Justin Hall, the person responsible for the first major anthology of queer comics, a history of queer comics, No Straight Lines. And they encouraged me to get involved in the project. And I kind of went, I don't know, I loved Alison Bechdel's work, but I don't know if I'm the right person. So Justin in particular encouraged me to attend the world's first in-gathering of queer comic book artists, organized initially by Jennifer Camper in New York in 2015. The minute I walked into the conference hall, I was astonished. There was this chartreuse-dyed, colored-haired person, young person, standing engaged in conversation with this Southern gentleman with a button-down Ivy League collared shirt, and they were completely engaged in conversation. And all around them was a whole variety of queer people of all color stripes, and they were all engaged together. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And then by the end of the few days of the conference, I had heard a lot of people talk. I had heard a lot of stories. I had heard a lot of great storytellers. So for documentary filmmakers, like bingo, a topic that really I didn't know much about, that had great storytellers and a plethora of images. What more could a filmmaker ask for?
Exactly. How did you go about putting your subjects together?
Well, actually, Justin had done the lion's share of that initially. It was pretty clear who the pioneers were that had to be in the film. We went back and forth, had some disagreements over who we could possibly cut out, because that was the painful part, was me as a storyteller. I was committed to not creating an encyclopedia, a list of who did what when. I wanted to be more about really good documentary storytelling. And so eventually we worked out a selection that I think obviously excludes some very key people, but also allows the audience to feel that they have a sense of connection with the 5 main people who are profiled, and hopefully curiosity to explore further.
Okay. This question is for Rupert and Jim, but can you talk just a little bit about how you got, interested in this industry?
Jen?
Well, I always drew and wrote ever since I was a little child, and I loved telling stories, and I loved both writing and drawing. So comics just sort of came naturally. And then when I was a teenager, I found Mary Wings and Roberta Gregory's underground comics, and those were the first queer comics I had ever seen. And then after that, I discovered Howard Cruz's work. And that's sort of, I was doing, comics that were very personal about my perspective, but seeing other people doing openly queer content really opened the door for me. And then, I just started making my own comics, and from there, it just exploded.
Yeah, for me, even as a kid, I was just really always creative. I was always, I felt like I had this desire and this need to be productive. I would take those plastic model hobby kits and assemble them and paint them, and became, pretty excited about, how I could transform a box of disjointed pieces into one completed piece. And at one point I was doing superhero models, and that's really what led me to really being attracted to comic books. And I started, as I mentioned in the documentary, I became kind of known in my neighborhood as one who could draw the superheroes. And eventually I started creating my own superheroes. And bit by bit, I started, at one point, once I really became a huge fan of Muhammad Ali's and his, his position in the Black community, and there was so much about him that I celebrated. I wanted to incorporate a lot of what I was learning from him into my own comic strips, or my sketchbooks, really, at that time as a kid. So I ended up creating a pretty militant character called Superbad.
Okay.
And eventually, once I went away to college, I became more interested in another boxer, Joe Louis, and his nickname was the Brown Bomber. And so I created a character called the Brown Bomber, and he was first published in the newspaper in college, Cornell College, for me. And so I really love the idea of just creating this world of characters. And it was just one way for me to constantly remain creative.
Okay. As gay people, we're always looking for other representation of ourselves. What was it like back then, when you first did start seeing other queer work out there and saying, oh, wow, I can, this is who I am, and I want to get more involved in this and do more. What was it like when you first discovered there were other people doing the kind of work you wanted to do?
Well, for me, I was excited to see anyone else who was doing queer content because it was so rare. But then the other side of that was everyone was doing very different work.
Yeah.
And talking about different aspects of our community. And so I felt very encouraged to tell my own story because nobody was doing my specific slant on, the queer existence. So it was a strange time where we were all trying to find each other, and yet there were so few of us that we each had sort of our own little version of what queer comics would be.
Yeah, I know when I first started being aware of queer comics, there were various formats, the one panel format or the 4-panel or the entire comic book. And Jen's right. At some point, it didn't take very long for me to realize I wasn't being represented in those comic strips, yet I was very aware that each of the cartoonists that I found myself introduced to, they did have a kind of different worlds. They came from different worlds, and it made me realize that one of the coolest things about their strips is how they would use what was going on in their life and their communities into their strips. So that's the thing that made me realize that I wasn't seeing very many people of color represented in these comic strips. So I thought, okay, well, that's certainly one way my comic strip could be different from the others. And this was during a time I was reading like The Advocate and Christopher Street. And, really at a certain point, you just realize they weren't catering at all, not only to images of people of color, but our unique communities. There was kind of a flavor that we had that wasn't being represented in the kaleidoscope of the queer experience.
Vivian, I wanted to ask you about, can you talk a little bit about the visual style of the film?
Yeah, it's actually, it was very challenging because on the one hand, I was just bragging on how this is a film that had a plethora of images. At the same time, they're static. they're flat two-dimensional works. And so what do you, how long can you sustain showing those without it becoming just structurally a little bit tiresome? So I set out to do something that was a little bit, that was actually going to work more in concert so that the form and the content would reflect each other rather than one being imposed on the other. And I did an experiment at one of the Queers and Comics conferences, and I invited a bunch of young people to talk with me for literally 10 minutes. I had an assistant who timed it 10 minutes to say hello and thank you. And I tried to just ask them questions that, so we had about 10 people. I tried to ask them questions that would tickle on the notion of their relationship with the pioneer, the work of the pioneer queer artist. And I didn't know how that would fit. At the end of that day of filming, my cinematographer, Andy Black, turned to me and said, you know, this is one of the most dynamic days of shooting, and I don't have a clue as to how you're going to incorporate this material in the film, because the two elements were so different, and I filmed them in a very different style.
Sure.
And I didn't know either. I just had a gut sense. And that's actually kind of what the creative process is about, following your intuition, not following a template, and just seeing where it leads. And after, just like Rupert was talking about the little plastic elements in the kit that would then get assembled into something else, a whole unit. That's what we do in the edit room. And we just played with different ideas, different motifs. For example, I was one day looking through one of Alison Bechdel's little publications that she had done, and she had put a black frame on the cover to have it signify a comic, and went, oh, I can do that too. If Alison can do it in the cover of her book, I can do it in the film. So little things, just there was an accrual of ideas, and I had a wonderful team of talented people. And together we came up with some new ways of inflecting the documentary vernacular.
This is a question for all three of you. I'm a huge documentary fan, and there's some extraordinary documentaries this year. Another film that we're showing this year is Invisible: Gay Women in Southern Music. For me, there were parallels. That movie is about songwriters who had done great work for a number of years and might not have gotten their due. And this film is about people who've done tremendous work in the industry and haven't gotten their due for a while, but are finally getting their due. Do you all see the parallels? And would you agree with that it's taken a while for you all to get your due?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that in any field, there's always the people who have access and those who don't, and those who are marginalized have to fight harder and make their own way. And certainly in comics, and I think Vivian captured this in the documentary, we all stood on each other's shoulders. There were people who came before us who opened doors and fought really hard, and and then there's always people who come after us who are gaining our the things that we fought for, and I think it's a real testament to community and sort of history within a marginalized community. Like with queer cartoonists, we all learned and benefited from each other in a tremendous way. Even if we didn't know each other, it was there.
Do either of you have any comments on that?
Rupert, do you want to take it, or shall I jump in?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of, actually, one thing I'd like to just add, which is something that Jen often talks about, is that there was no money to be gotten from it. And so there was no expectation. And the means of production were accessible for do-it-yourself art. And I think that kind of, left that, it let people be very happy doing what they were doing and speaking to a smaller community. And then with the rise of the internet, there was at first trauma, and then that led to some new levels of discovery and creation, and so that today we have webcomics. So it's kind of been this evolutionary process that has had both plus and minus along the way.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I would say for me, I've certainly come across a number of documentaries that really intrigued me over over the years. And one of the things that I really appreciated about this as a documentary was how it really ended up being a celebration of that one community. There's so many subsets of the queer community and other communities in general, but there's just something about having a number of creative people, artists, cartoonists laid out in front of you, and you're getting such a sense of the backgrounds and the journeys and the stories of all these individuals that makes me so proud to be a part of it.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about, I mean, the community. I mean, in terms of other artists who are doing comparable work, how do you find out about their work? How do you see each other? And what's the community like?
It's all different ways. I mean, before the internet, we would see each other's work in the queer press or in the books or mini comics that we all would publish. And then sometimes a lot of us met at conferences or conventions. In the 90s, there was the Outright Writers Conference, Queer Writers Conference, and we always would fight to have a cartoonist panel and that, get us all together. And then, the more alternative comic book conventions like APE and MoCA and SPX, there would always be a handful of queers there. And then once the internet came along, that changed things because suddenly you had access internationally to other people. And, a lot of it's just word of mouth, like any community. You're always looking for your own kind, and we are a subset of a subset. Comics are really bastardized art form and not really, for a long time, wasn't really accepted as a legitimate art form. And then if you're doing LGBTQ content within this bastardized, you're really a niche of a niche. And so, when we ever discovered somebody else, we would, reach out or just, we were hungry to read each other's work. That said, I will say that we are now in a time period where there's so much queer content in comics. I have the luxury to not read it. There's some of it that I'm not interested in this. I can skip it, and that's a real luxury to have that happen.
Okay.
Well, I think that it is so fascinating when I think in terms of being old enough to really have experienced the growing market of queer comics, and not only queer comics, but just the variety of comics. I mean, when I was younger, it was all about superhero comics, and it was mostly white men, and you'd always see Wonder Woman, but other than that, for me, there was an awareness of what that world was like back in the 60s for me. And then becoming more and more aware of my sexuality, I started becoming more and more familiar with certain publications. And then I find out that they'd have, one panel cartoons. And then I used to go in Chicago to these kind of comic stores that didn't only deal with mainstream comics, they dealt with underground comics. And there was like this explosion of expression in that field. And then I ended up becoming really involved with a lot of queer newspapers around the country because I was art director of a number of newspapers, and each of the queer newspapers all over the country had subscriptions to each other's publications. And so that was another major way that I started becoming more and more aware of the variety of different voices in that world. But as I say, it's fascinating to really look back and know that you experienced this overview of what it was like in the beginning, and that you just see this progression and these different forms of expression more and more. And Jen is right, it's now like it's such an explosion that certainly back in the day, if I saw anything with queer content, I felt like I had to, figure out what it was about, or I was very interested. And today there's so much that even if I see a drawing style that doesn't quite appeal to me, I'm not attracted. But back in the day, I don't care. I would want to read it.
Sure, sure. Vivian, obviously 2020 was a year none of us anticipated, and we're still having the effects of that this year, but we are actually getting to the point where festivals are happening, a lot of performances are happening. What's it like to spend so much time with this film and to be able to share this and see it with an audience and just feel the energy and the appreciation and share it with your, like Frameline? What was Frameline like, being able to share this with your community and just being live?
Well, Jim, you nailed it right there with Frameline, because for Frameline being the San Francisco Queer Film Festival, held at the magnificent Castro Theater, the Movie Palace extraordinaire,
Yes.
with, by the way, a live organist who emerges from beneath the stage and plays and ends by playing San Francisco. It was completely magnificent. Almost everyone was walking into the theater saying it's the first time they had seen a film since pre-COVID, and the first time they'd been with other people outside of their pods since COVID. So it was extremely moving experience. And I have to say how, one of the joys of having chosen to immerse myself in this community, in this subject, is that these are such great people and wonderful folks to hang out with and party with at festivals and not at festivals. And also to bring a film that is not only joyful and entertaining, but also is poignant. And so at the Castro Theater, for example, a lot of folks, it was audible, crying during certain sections of the film that are very moving. So to have the film emerge now at a time in the middle of this pandemic, hopefully towards the tail end of it,
Yes.
is especially moving and poignant for me.
So what
Can I have one more comment, Jim? I have to say what a surprise it is as well. I did not make this film for this broad audience. I made it for a queer audience, and yet to have a film, have our stories embraced by Tribeca and Sheffield and AFI, all of these, the major festivals of our independent filmmaking. It's just a testament to the value of this community and the queer comics community and the stories that they tell and the artwork that they have accomplished.
Congratulations to all of you for that. So what are your next projects? What are you all working on next?
Jen, do you want to say something?
Oh, I'm just plugging away at a lot of stories. Eventually they'll be compiled into another book. One of the things that I think is interesting when you look at like Vivian's film, it really captures how much our comics are a document of our times. And, when you look at the gay history from, say, the 1960s to the present, and all that has happened and all the change that has come and how that's reflected in our work, that's just a fascinating way to preserve our history. And so I'm kind of thinking about the work that we're doing now. How does that talk about, the world that we live in now? And anyway, a lot of different topics obviously are going to come up, but yeah, I'm working on a lot of new comics, and eventually, there'll be a big fat book of them.
Great.
Well, it's because of No Straight Lines that once again, this whole concept of developing an overview of the history of something has prompted me to evaluate my career as a cartoonist. And I've been made really to understand the kind of groundbreaking nature of the comic strip, because for decades I never thought about it. It wasn't until there was an almanac out and about, and it's like an encyclopedia of gay history, and they featured the Brown Bomber Diva in the book, and basically noted that they were the oldest African-American queer characters in comics. Once I realized that, I really just started looking at the trajectory of the whole comic strip and the history of it. And so my comic strip started as far back as my college days, and those are pretty rare strips. So I'm really excited to continue to work on the history of cathartic comics from the beginning to all of the things that have happened with the comic strip to this day. So I'm really excited about that. I feel like I'm just kind of exploring the quagmire of options of ways to get things published at this point. But it really is because of being out and about and being featured in the documentary that has just given me this fuel to really want to share the history of the strip with people, because it's full of all kinds of interesting stories and things that never would have happened to me if I had not created those characters so many years ago.
Okay, Vivian?
Yeah, and pre-COVID, I was awarded a really generous fellowship called the Eureka Fellowship for Artists, and I had in mind an idea for a film that I was going to pursue with that funding. And then with COVID, that topic feels less urgent, and so I'm going to put that on the shelf a little bit. And one of the joys of the success of No Straight Lines is I've been approached by some people to do a commissioned work. So hooray for getting the bills paid.
Congratulations. I was a little gassed a little bit earlier before we started this when I found out that neither Vivian or Rupert had ever been to Atlanta. So we have to do something about it. We have to get you here next year. We have to get all three of you down here. I would love to have a live screening with this with all of you down here. I think that would be tremendously well received. Congratulations on this film. It's amazing. Vivian, Rupert, Jen, thank you so much for the film. Thank you for joining us today. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much, Jim, for all the work that you're doing.
You have a great
Thanks
day. Thanks so much.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.